Our next speaker is David Remy, but lest you not hear me afterwards through the applause, in the coffee break afterwards, which is going to have a length of negative 10 minutes, I think, there's going to be a demonstration of an aquatic robot in the pond. And I don't know how you get there, but it's in that direction. What? Through that door, you can drink pond water instead of drinking coffee. Okay, David.
All right, thank you, Andy. The reason why we didn't want to do a lab talk is because it seems like our lab has a serious problem with a lack of focus. So it's about gaits. And I've been fascinated by gaits for a long time. It's sort of this notion that animals at different speeds use totally different ways of moving around. And then also sort of this idea that if you change the animal, the gaits remain mostly the same. And that is something that seems to extend beyond nature. So in a lot of our work, we ran these numerical optimizations when we asked the computer, here's a model, can you find the most optimal way of locomoting? And then you do this at different speeds, and boom, you get the same gaits that you see in nature. Walking, trotting, and galloping for quadrupeds, and then walking and running for bipeds. What's the reason behind that, right? And sort of the way we started to think about this for a long time now is probably best explained by an analogy. And I think to start it, you have to think about this. This has to be something mechanical, right? Because in the models on the right where we see the same gaits, the only thing that is in there are the mechanics. There's no brain, there's no big actuator models. It's all just mechanical dynamics. So the analogy that we think about is essentially that of an oscillator. If you have two masses on a stick, they can move together, and then there's another mode where they move against each other. And if you're close to these motions, you get resonance, which means that small inputs have a big effect, and you get a lot of motion out of a very small effect. And so that's how we think about gaits, where we say, well, are there some underlying passive natural motions that exists because of the mechanical dynamics? And then if you locomote, you want to stay close to them to get something that is similar, like resonance, where you get most bang for your buck. To study this, and when I say we, most of this was done by my student, Jen Yugan, took these active models and converted them into something passive. So we got rid of the actuators, we made the springs without damping, we let the foot mass go against zero, and ended up with something that's completely passive now, that has no actuation, but we did it very carefully to keep sort of the dynamics intact. So we left the springs in and played some tricks to essentially get swing lag dynamics in this now completely passive model. And then we started looking for different gaits, if we can find different gaits in this very, very simple model. And obviously, we're not the first to do that. The most well-known example is Hartmut Geijer's work, where he was sort of the first to show that a modified slip model can walk and run if you choose the parameters right. I think the biggest limitation in that study is this notion of an angle of attack. So as soon as a foot leaves the ground, it just jumps forward without any physical swing lag dynamics. And that means you can get everything that you want. In order to get different gaits, you need to change that angle of attack. And then also you get a lot of stuff that's unrealistic, where the leg just barely lifts up, it just boom, snaps forward, something that you could never do in a robot. So more related to our work, yet well hidden. So the advisor of the student did a good job promoting this work, is Sean O'Connor's PhD thesis, where he built a model with swing lag dynamics. So there's a spring at the hip that generates swing leg motion. And he was able to show that that model can also do different gaits. So found walking and skipping and galloping. And that's sort of what we do as well, right? We take our model, we search for limit cycles, orbits in the state space, passive motions that generate locomotion. And if you do that long enough, you find different types of these. So there's walking, and then you can, with the same model without changing the parameters, you can also find running. Now, the real challenge comes then thinking about how do we find all of these, right? How do we systematically find all of the motions that this model can do?
Is that mechanically completely, there's no Hartmut Geijer cheating in this at all?
There's...
Hartmut Geijer cheating would, for example, be that the swing foot comes to a dead stop automatically when it leaves the ground and doesn't oscillate during swing?
We do that type. I don't know if I would call it cheating because the feet have no mass.
But they also have no damping because you have a dissipative free system there.
I think in the limit, I would think about it that you have no mass, you have infinite oscillations, and they basically
and so
die out at zero
you could take
time.
a limit of no mass and damping going to zero in the right ratio so that the characteristic time of the damped oscillations would go to zero and the net energy would go to zero, you think?
That's how we would think about it. But I think this is sort of a minor, well, I don't know if it's a minor detail because we still keep working on sort of an extended version of this.
Okay.
But a little bit of cheating. Also a little bit of cheating, you see that the legs are going through the ground, which we have to allow because we don't have knees in there. But other than that, it's just purely mechanical. There's no control. There's no angle of attack or anything. Okay, so the question was, how do we find all of them? And the way to do this is actually fairly established in nonlinear systems, that you do a numerical continuation. So meaning once I've found a limit cycle, I perturb it a little bit in its neighborhood, simulate again, see what I get, and I basically get a change in this disturbance, right? And I do this in many directions, just probing the system, and typically I would not find another periodic gate, but what I get from this is a map how disturbances change over the course of a stride. I linearize that map, I find its eigenvalues, and if I find an eigenvalue of 1, that means I have hit jackpot, and I know that there is another solution around. The reason for that is because if I have an eigenvalue with an eigenvector with an eigenvalue of 1, I can disturb the system in that direction. Because it's an eigenvector, it will not change the direction of that disturbance. Because it has an eigenvalue of 1, it will not change its magnitude. And it basically means I found a disturbance that resulted in another periodic orbit. And I can just keep repeating that process, and then I get essentially a branch of solutions that might be a function of energy, a function of speed, however you want to parameterize that. And while we do that, we carefully look at all the other eigenvectors and associated eigenvalues, and we look out for instances where another eigenvalue becomes 1. For example, in this case, and now I have 2 eigenvalues of 1, meaning I can actually move in 2 directions, and I can branch off of this original branch of solutions here. And I just found a bifurcation. And you repeat the process over and over again, and what you essentially generate is a tree or a map of solutions that, starting from one original simple solution, branches out in the entire variety that you can find here. So we did this, starting with the model just bouncing and running in place. And what we found is basically this. A tree in which different branches correspond to different gates in the system. And you can think of this almost as a map of all gates. Starting from bouncing and hopping in place, which is down here, we find walking, we find running, we find forward hopping, we find skipping, and galloping. So all the gates that you would see in nature show up from this very, very simple model. They're all connected through these bifurcations to simply bouncing and hopping in place. And what I find particularly interesting, they're all isolated, right? You just have these branches that are not, it's not a continuum. So if you go from one gate to another, you really have to jump. I know I'm running out of time, but I want to share with you a little bit of insight of how that branching happens physically and what's happening here. So if we look at a very simple first branch that we identify, which is just running in place, right? And as you increase energy, you run at higher heights, as you can see along these animations. If you hop at higher heights, it takes more time. There's a nonlinear system, so the frequency at which stuff happens is coupled to amplitude. So if I hop higher, I spend more time flying, and that allows me to match the vertical motion to the motion of the swing leg. So these are now all the running branches that come out of this original stem, and you see sort of human-like running here, but then if I go to higher energy levels, I find these weird running motions where I have multiple swing leg oscillations that are matched to one vertical motion. So what we're doing here is essentially matching timing and frequencies. And I can do this. You see they always show up in pairs of 2. The reason for that is because I can do this matching either with a full oscillation Or over here, I do it kind of with an oscillation that is cut short when the foot hits the ground in a forward motion. I can do this frequency matching the other way around. So this is now a branch that goes from walking to skipping. And you see that my ground reaction forces, they go from triple hump over the branch here to double hump ground reaction forces. So now I have sort of one motion in the swing, and I have different frequencies or different number of oscillations in the vertical motion. And then you probably identified this one here as the most human-like natural walking. So we have this matching of different timings of different frequencies. Another way of looking at this is, and this time I explain it with just looking at hopping in place, you can think of this here as breaks in symmetry. The motion that we see here is sort of perfectly symmetric in the forward-backward direction and left and right. So I can switch left and right and still have the same motion. I can switch forward-backward, I still have the same motion. But I can break these symmetries and the bifurcations and, for example, start hopping forward. Now I broke the forward-backward symmetry. Left-right symmetry is still intact. And I can now do an additional break in symmetry where I now get a desynchronization between left and right, and this is what's leading to this galloping gait, right, that branches off hopping. I think that's all the time I have. What we get in the end is sort of this map, this tree of all different gaits. Please note that they're much more than the ones that are shown here. It gets fairly complicated very quickly. And we don't think it's definite proof, but I think it's sort of nice evidence that the gaits that we see in nature and that we see in our robots are probably manifestations of these passive dynamics that are inherent to the mechanical system. And there's just a finite number of them, and that's why we assume that we see all the same gaits in all animals. Here's the summary. It's bad. For motion that are orbits of states, we see branching when symmetry breaks. Through continuation and bifurcation, we get a map of all gaits. Can you hold your question for just 1 second?
Say again?
Just before we start questions, I want to pitch my students' posters. So this is Jenny Gan. If this wasn't complex enough, he did this for quadrupeds. Go talk to him. He's also looking for a postdoc position. Just mentioning. We have Yu Ming, who's now with Michael Posa, and he tried to do different gaits on our robot. And then we have Cheng, who tried the same approach with the slip model. And now we can compare the solutions that you get there and the solutions that we got in our approach. The complexity here is so that he actually 3D printed graphs so he can show them to you. Thank you. And we can go back to this.
I wonder if this same sort of ability to generate a bunch of gaits could be done without springs at all. So like Manoj and Andy treated it as an optimization problem where it's just actuators, no springs, and then it turned out that even though there's no energy, elastic energy return, the optimization still says act with a quasi-stiffness that looks similar.
I second that question.
I think that's a great puzzle, and that's something I've been wondering about, because we all know sort of Manoj and Andy's paper, where what they did was they took out all the dynamics and made it all actuation. Right? There are these telescoping legs that just produce forces. So no dynamics, all actuation. What we do is all dynamics and no actuation. So we run away in opposite directions and then we somehow meet. I don't know, it must be like some circular space. But I don't know the answer to that question. It's a good puzzle.
So a question back here. We've seen a couple of different situations where if you, if you cheat a little bit and you say, okay, I can actually create a control policy for my foot placement, now you can use that input to do a continuous transition from hopping in place up through walking, up through running. Or with Atreus, what we did was basically insert more energy, and it's a damped oscillator. So there's energy being lost all the time, and then you're pumping that energy in all the time. And again, we could do the continuum from walking through running. So what I'm curious about is if you, can you speculate on what this plot would look like if you, I don't know, let's say just make it a damped spring mass system where you can also change the amount of energy that you're inserting. Because with this, it's very brittle. If it's a real system and you're off a little bit with an energetically conservative, robot as close as possible, then small errors are going to diverge. Damping makes it stable. Now, can you do continuums between them? What would it look like?
Just for a language thing, I think, John, in the dynamic systems, they call this model is a structurally unstable model, meaning any random small perturbation destroys the features of the model.
Right, so we make no claims about stability. We make no claims about
No,
energy
it's not that the word
usage
stability in that was not about stability. The model is unstable, meaning the features of the model disappear when you make small perturbations to the model. It's an instability of the features with respect to the model ingredients, not an instability of the motion. It's just a different language of saying what John said, so you can ignore me if you don't know what I'm talking about.
Okay, can I stick to Jonathan's language, maybe?
Yes.
It's a good question. That's sort of the next thing that we're trying to do. So what happens basically when you take an active system and you slowly turn it into something passive? And how do these things evolve in that process? And what happens sort of in terms of a gradient infinitesimally around these trajectories? Do they just blow up and go away? Or do they stick around and really become these underlying dynamics that dominate what we're doing in terms of gait? And I think in terms of proving that this is what's driving gait in real physics, I think that's the missing piece. So you put your finger right there where if I will call this a proof, that would be the missing piece, yeah.
So your galloping gait reminded me of Crutch Gait. So when you have bilateral crutches and you want to move really rapidly, you have what's called swing-through gait, where both crutches move forward at the same time and then both legs move forward at the same time. So I'm wondering if you were to replace one of the pendula with a rigid body and the other with a spring body, if we'd be able to replicate that swing-through gait mechanism, and if that might be another way of people thinking about moving, because we're always talking about bipedal gait, but in reality, if you think about Crutch Gait, so then you could either have sort of two moving limbs, or if you do reciprocal gait, where the crutches are moving opposite of the limbs, and then you almost are a quadrupedal gait. So I'm just wondering, can you replace your model with one rigid pendula, and the other would be a spring pendula to mimic this concept of a swing through crutch gait?
Okay. So what you can do is, of course, you can add more legs, and you should just talk to Jenny if you're interested in that. Having rigid legs in this particular model without modifying other things might be problematic, because it means that you have energy losses, and then you can't find passive gaits at all anymore. So you would need to include some slope or some energy generating mechanism.
Building off Jonathan's question, I wonder if you could imagine adding a little bit of damping and a little bit of actuation, and then thinking of the continuation of locally optimal trajectories.
I can imagine that. We tried it. And this is where then the point that Andy raised becomes tricky, because in this limit, if I have zero masses, I need zero masses to have no collisions. And if I have zero masses, I can sort of...
That's not true. That's my next question. Go ahead.
Okay, keep that for yourself, just for a moment. But if having zero masses works because you do limits and then stuff falls out and you're good. Approaching zero masses becomes a little bit more nasty, because it means you get very high frequencies, right? If the frequencies are already infinite, then I can ignore them. But sort of in the process, we need to really think about how to get there. So it's a good idea. It's what we're trying to do. We're not there yet.
I'm going to let myself ask a question. You could take a subset of these two related questions, both about the collisions problem, So you in these simulations, you have two collisions which have no impact because your mass of your foot is zero. You have a tangential collision and a normal collision. And you pointed out that when you have these split solutions, one of them has a bigger tangential solution and one a smaller tangential solution. What if you just cross off all the solutions that have any tangential solution at all? That will turn your curves into a sequence of dots. Have you looked at these are the ground matching, the speed ground matching solutions. Those will just be dots on that curve, presumably. Have you looked at that? And then the second question to go with that.
I have not.
Okay, the second question is if you put mass on the foot, a finite mass, not a small mass, then there are solutions where you get no collision whatsoever. And
where you have ground speed matching.
Where you have ground speed matching both normally and tangentially.
Right.
And I mean, that's also going to be some dots there. Do you know if there are a lot of those dots or only a few of those dots? You have any idea?
To be honest, I don't think there's going to be a lot of dots.
Okay.
I think tangentially we have fairly good ground speed matching, but we have, actually, I think I can.
So there might be no
this.
dots except for in vertical hopping.
There is going to be one dot, and it's this guy up here. So let me go back a few slides to all the running solutions. And you see that they come up in these pairs, where this one is the foot striking the ground moving backwards. This is the foot striking the ground moving forwards. And I believe that's the point where the two meet, that's the point you talk about, where there's basically no relative ground motion at contact.
Tangentially. And then normally is another issue.
I think
normally you don't have,
normally as well. I think it's really the point where
but you don't have information about normally because your leg you don't have a bouncing spring. You have a normal impact in your
right, but I think it's basically the point where the normal motion, instead of going, you have sort of one is going down this way and the other is going down that way, and then when they meet,
if they're going vertically and you still have a normal collision.
Not 100% sure.
Good. Yes.
Coffee.
Okay,
Your
coffee.
discussion.
Who wants? How good are your guys' negative watches in terms of how much negative time do you want for your coffee? One more question, maybe. Okay.
So you applied your methods for limit cycles that are some notion of steady gait, right? Can you apply these methods to things that aren't steady gait? So either like accelerating gait or stopping gait or something like that. Can you find a family of solutions for gait initiation or family of solutions for stopping
I
gait?
think the continuation will work. I mean, what the continuation does is basically it finds families of solutions to nonlinear equations. So if you have one, you find all of them. And so it doesn't have to be periodic. You would need to rephrase it a little bit differently, but you could use the same tool, yeah. It's fairly standard.
Okay, I've got one announcement. Totally surprisingly, the Boston Dynamics talk after the break is not going to be broadcast. And therefore, if you want to see it, you can't see it in the satellite rooms. You have to see it in here. So now we have the break.